The envelope had been sitting on the kitchen table for 11 days. Maren Caudill had walked past it every morning, past the chipped ironstone pitcher on the sill, past the coffee tin with the bent lid, past the stack of almanacs her father had marked up in pencil before his hands got too bad to hold a pen. She had walked past it on her way out to the barn at 4:30 each morning, and she had walked past it again coming back in, her boots leaving half-moons of red Georgia clay on the pine floor she had refinished herself the summer of 2019. She had looked at the return address once, that first morning, and then she had made a deliberate choice to look somewhere else entirely. The envelope was from the Bartow County Agricultural Extension Office. And the letterhead, just visible through the thin paper when the morning light came through the east window just right, read, Heritage Pork Initiative, Certification of Record Sales. 11 days she had let it sit. Because Maren Caudill was a woman who had learned, the hard way, the only way a certain kind of lesson ever really sticks, that the moment you let yourself believe something good, the ground shifts under you. She had watched the ground shift enough times to be careful about it. So the envelope sat, and she walked past it, and she let the days accumulate the way snow accumulates on a fence post, quietly, without drama, until the weight of it becomes undeniable. On the 12th morning, a Thursday in mid-January 2023, she picked it up. But before we get to what was inside it, before we get to the number written on that letter, the number that would make a loan officer in Cartersville, Georgia go pale and quiet in a way that constituted, for a man like him, the closest thing to an apology he'd ever manage, we have to go back to the morning they laughed at her. They didn't laugh all at once. That would have been easier, in some ways. A single burst of sound you could step away from. What they did was worse, they laughed in sequence, one after another, over the span of about 2.5 years, as if they had been passing a joke down a line and each man had to add his own embellishment before handing it on. The first one to laugh was Dale Fetters. Dale was the county extension agent for Cherokee and Bartow counties, had been for going on 22 years, and he was the kind of man who wore his certainty the way he wore his button-down shirts, tucked in tight, no give at the sides. He came out to the Caudill place in the spring of 2017, driving a county green pickup down the long gravel road that wound past the old tobacco barn her grandfather had built in 1948, past the sagging fence line her father had always meant to repair, and he parked in front of the house and looked out at the 63 acres of red clay hillside and scrub pine and creek bottom that Maren had inherited the previous autumn, and he said, with the particular brand of kindness that contains very little of the thing, that she might want to consider leasing the bottom pasture to the Hutchins family for hay and selling the timber rights on the upper ridge. Maren had just turned 34. She was standing on the porch in her barn coat, holding a mug she'd stopped drinking from, and she told Dale Fetters that she was planning to run hogs on the property. He asked what kind. She said Ossabaw Island. The laugh was short. More of an exhale, really. But it carried everything it needed to carry. Ossabaw Island hogs, the small, fat, prehistoric-looking descendants of Spanish pigs brought to the Georgia Sea Islands in the 16th century, were not a commercial proposition. They were a curiosity. A zoo animal. Something academics studied because of their unusual insulin resistance and their potential usefulness in diabetes research. They were not something a woman alone ran on 63 acres of red clay in North Georgia to turn a profit. Dale Fetters explained this in polite and thorough language while Maren stood on her porch and let him finish. Then she asked if he wanted coffee before he drove back. He said no thank you. And she watched his county green truck disappear down the gravel road, and she stood there for a moment in the particular silence of a place that has been underestimated, and then she went inside and got her notebook. The notebook was a black composition book, the cheap kind from the dollar store, and on the cover she had written a single word in blue pen, Ossabaw. Inside it, over the previous 8 months, she had accumulated 47 pages of research. Not internet browsing, research. Letters to Dr. Anike Hedinger at the University of Georgia, who had been studying the breed since the late 1990s. Correspondence with the Ossabaw Island Foundation. 3 handwritten conversations with Eloise Parham, an elderly woman in Savannah who had been raising Ossabaw hogs on a small scale since 1981 and whose knowledge of the breed's forage patterns, rooting behavior, and seasonal weight fluctuations was, as far as Maren could tell, stored entirely in her head and had never been written down anywhere. Phone calls to 2 heritage pork restaurateurs in Atlanta and 1 in Chattanooga, Tennessee, asking them directly what they would pay per pound for heritage pork from a breed with documented provenance and clean pasture-raising practices. The answer from the Chattanooga chef had been the one that made Maren sit down. He had said, without hesitating, $8 a pound for whole carcass, 10 for select cuts, and he had said he would need to see the land and the records but that if everything was as she described he could commit to a standing order. She had written that figure in the notebook with 3 underlines. Dale Fetters had not asked to see the notebook. The land itself was the second problem everyone pointed to, and here the laughter had a different quality, not dismissive so much as genuinely puzzled, the way people sound when they cannot understand why you insist on seeing something they cannot see. The 63 acres of the Caudill place were, by conventional farming standards, nearly worthless. The upper third was too steep and too rocky for row crops. The middle section, which her father had tried twice to put into improved pasture and twice watched wash out in summer storms, was dominated by a mix of broomsage, blackberry, persimmon, and scrub oak. The creek bottom, which might have been productive bottomland in a wetter county, dried to a trickle by late July and flooded unpredictably in March. The county soil survey described the dominant type as pacolet sandy loam, highly erodible, low in organic matter, with a cation exchange capacity that made a row crop farmer wince. What the county soil survey did not say, and what Maren had come to understand through that winter of reading, was that pacolet sandy loam on a hillside covered in persimmon and scrub oak, adjacent to a creek with natural mast production and a dense understory of native plants, was close to ideal habitat for a breed that had been living wild on Georgia barrier islands for 400 years. Ossabaw hogs were not bred for confinement and grain. They were bred, by 4 centuries of survival pressure, for exactly this kind of difficult, semi-wooded, mast-producing southern terrain. They could maintain body condition on forage that would starve a commercial hog. Their fat-to-muscle ratio, the thing that made their meat extraordinary, was a direct product of the slow, varied, stress-free foraging life their genetics demanded. She had written, in the notebook, a phrase she had lifted from a paper by Dr. Hettinger, "The land they laughed at may be the only land that makes them right." She kept that page open on the kitchen table the whole first winter. The first 4 animals arrived on a Tuesday in March 2017. Maren had driven down to Tattnall County herself, alone, in her father's old stock trailer that she had spent 2 weekends rewelding and repainting, and she had loaded 4 Ossabaw gilts from a small breeder named Cordell Wyatt who had been raising them quietly for 11 years and who, when she pulled out her notebook and started asking questions, had looked at her for a long moment and then said something she would think about for years afterward. He said, "Most people come here and want to know how much trouble they are. You're the first one in a while who wanted to know what they need." She drove back to Bartow County with those 4 gilts in the trailer, for hours of interstate and state highway, and she could hear them settling in behind her, the small, compressed sounds of animals adjusting to a new motion, and she thought about what Cordell Wyatt had said. About what it meant to ask what something needed instead of asking what it would cost you. The first boar, a registered Ossabaw named by Wyatt's records as Canaveral Line 7, arrived 6 weeks later. He was 18 months old, dense and low to the ground, with the breed's characteristic heavy jowl and coarse salt and pepper coat and the alert, ancient-looking eyes that made Ossabaw hogs look less like livestock and more like something that remembered a time before fences. Maren had built the first paddock herself over the course of 3 weeks, 4-board wooden fence on the perimeter, a strand of electric on the inside to discourage rooting at the posts, a simple 3-sided shed on the high ground with a corrugated tin roof that pinged in the rain. The whole paddock covered about 3 acres of the mid-slope scrub, and she had dragged the brush into piles along the edges and left the persimmon trees standing and scattered 2 bushels of acorns from the ridge oaks by hand along the floor of it the morning before the gilts arrived. They had gone into that paddock and immediately begun to move through it in the particular unhurried way Ossabaw hogs move, not rooting frantically the way a confinement hog does, but walking slowly, nose down, reading the ground the way you read a letter from someone you have been waiting to hear from. She had stood at the fence and watched them for a long time. The second laugh came from the bank. Raymond Poole was the agricultural loan officer at First Community Bank of Cartersville, and he was not a cruel man. He was a man shaped by 30 years of watching North Georgia farms fail, which had given him a deep and genuine caution that expressed itself, on the afternoon of June 14, 2017, as something that sounded like concern but landed like contempt. Maren had come to him with a business plan. 43 pages, spiral-bound, with a cover sheet and a table of contents. She had projected her first profitable year at year 3, her debt service covered by year 4, and she had attached letters of interest from 2 Atlanta restaurants and the Chattanooga chef, whose name was Grady Llewellyn and who had since graduated from a letter of interest to a signed memorandum of understanding. Raymond Poole had read the plan. He had read it, or he had done the thing people do that resembles reading, turning pages at intervals, making small sounds. And then he had looked up and asked her if she had considered leasing the land instead. She told him she was asking for a $7,000 operating loan. He said the breed was unproven in commercial markets. She turned to page 12 of the business plan and showed him the price per pound figures and the signed memorandum from Grady Llewellyn. He said the land wouldn't support the stocking rate she was proposing. She turned to page 21 and showed him the pasture rotation schedule and the forage survey she had conducted herself over 2 fall seasons, plant by plant, acre by acre, cross-referenced against the breed's documented nutritional requirements. Raymond Poole looked at the forage survey. He looked at it for a while. And then he said, and these were his exact words, that he had been in agricultural lending for 30 years and he had never seen a single operator heritage hog business on marginal land make it past year 2. Maren Caudill looked at him across the desk. She looked at him long enough that the silence got uncomfortable. And then she said, quietly, that he probably hadn't seen this particular combination of breed and land before, because if he had he would know that everything he'd just described as a liability was actually what made it work. She did not get the loan. She went home and she sat on the porch steps in the last of the June light and she let herself be angry for about 20 minutes. Not at Raymond Poole specifically. At the accumulated weight of all the expertise being deployed against her, the extension agent, the banker, the neighbors who stopped at the fence and shook their heads and said things like, "Bless her heart, she doesn't know what she's getting into." The particular Georgia form of condescension that comes wrapped in warmth. 20 minutes. Then she went inside and called her aunt in Dalton and borrowed $4,000 at no interest, and she called Cordell Wyatt and asked him what the minimum viable starting herd looked like if she was operating on tight capital, and she wrote everything he said in the notebook, and she went to bed. The third laugh was quieter, but it came from someone she had expected to be different. Her nearest neighbor, a retired schoolteacher named Harris Bonner who had farmed his adjacent 80 acres in tobacco and then soybeans and then mostly just mowed it, came over one evening in the fall of 2017 and leaned on her fence and watched the Ossabaw gilts working the persimmon drop and said, with what she could tell was genuine affection, that they were interesting-looking animals. And then he said he hoped she knew what she was doing because heritage breeds had been a trend for a while and trends ended. She liked Harris Bonner. She didn't hold it against him. She said she wasn't counting on a trend. She was counting on people who cooked serious food always wanting fat with flavor in it, and on the fact that an Ossabaw hog raised on mast and native forage produced fat with a depth of flavor that no commodity pork ever would, and on the further fact that there were approximately 600 registered Ossabaw hogs left in the continental United States, which meant the supply side of this equation was going to remain constrained for a long time regardless of what trends did. Harris Bonner thought about this. He said, 600? She said, fewer than that now. Some of the foundation stock on the island itself is down to about 80 animals. He was quiet for a while. The hogs moved through the persimmon light below them, unhurried, the afternoon going amber around them. He said, well, let me know if you need a hand with fencing. And that was the beginning of something. The winter of 2017 into 2018 was the hardest. Not because things went wrong with the hogs were, in fact, doing exactly what the research had predicted. They were maintaining weight on forage through October, acorns through November, and transitioning smoothly to supplemental feed through the coldest months in a way that confirmed the breed's legendary metabolic efficiency. The first litter came in February, 9 piglets from the gilt Maren had privately named Piedmont, all of them healthy, with the characteristic dish-faced heads and coarse coats that meant pure breed. She had sat in the cold shed with a flashlight for the last 2 hours of that farrowing, not because Ossabaw sows are bad mothers, they are, by general agreement, exceptional mothers, but because it was the first farrowing and she needed to know how it went, needed to feel it happen. 9 piglets. She had written the date in the notebook with 3 underlines, same as the price per pound figure. The hardship that winter was money. The kind of financial pressure that doesn't announce itself all at once but accumulates in small increments, the electric bill when the water lines froze, the mineral supplement she couldn't shortcut on, the vet call in March when one of the gilts got a wire cut that needed cleaning and suturing. She was working part-time at a farm supply store in Cartersville 3 days a week, driving the 22 minutes each way and coming home in the dark and going out to the barn with a headlamp and a bucket and doing what needed doing in the cold. There were evenings that winter when she sat at the kitchen table after everything was done and looked at the numbers in her notebook and understood, clearly and without drama, that she had left herself very little margin. That if one serious thing went wrong, a disease outbreak, a bad farrowing season, a buyer who changed their mind, the whole thing could come undone. She had looked at those numbers and she had felt something move through her chest that was not exactly fear but lived in the same neighborhood. And then she had closed the notebook and made tea and gone to bed, because what else do you do? The first real sale happened in June 2018. 2 whole carcasses and 14 pounds of select cuts to a restaurant in Atlanta called Sycamore and Stone, which had opened the previous year with a menu that was, as the food writer for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution had described it, anchored in a serious commitment to provenance. The chef, a woman named Priya Rasmussen who had trained in Charleston and come back to Georgia with ideas about what Southern food could be when it was freed from nostalgia and given back its rigor, had reached out to Maren through a network of small heritage producers that Maren had been quietly cultivating for 2 years. Priya Rasmussen came out to the farm on a Wednesday in April, just herself, driving a small blue car that she parked behind the barn without being asked. She walked the paddocks for 40 minutes and asked questions that were, in Maren's experience, the questions of someone who actually needed to know the answers. She asked about the breed's lineage documentation, the foraging rotation, the mineral supplementation protocol, the processing chain. She crouched down and looked at the hogs from close range and watched how they moved. She dug her thumb into the soil at the edge of the creek paddock and looked at what came up on it and said, "Okay. Just okay." But she said it the way someone says a word when it closes a question that has been open for a long time. The check that came for that first delivery was for $2,040. Maren had deposited it on a Thursday morning and then she had driven straight from the bank to the feed store and paid what she owed there, and on the way home she had stopped at Harris Bonner's mailbox and left a note that just said, "First sale. Thank you for the fence posts. M." He brought her a jar of his wife's sourwood honey the next afternoon. He didn't say anything about the note. He just set the honey on the porch railing and asked if the spring gilts were growing out the way she'd expected. They were. They were growing out better than she'd expected. By the end of 2018 she had 14 sows, 3 boars from 2 different Ossabaw lines to maintain genetic diversity, the Canaveral line from Cordell Wyatt and a Ossabaw Island line she had tracked down through the Ossabaw Island Foundation to a small breeder in Beaufort, South Carolina, and a rotation system across 4 paddocks that let her rest each section through the summer growing season and restock it with the fall mast crop. She had sold regularly to Sycamore and Stone and added 2 more Atlanta accounts, and she had attended 3 small farmers markets in Cartersville and Canton and sold out every time. The farmers market sales were not part of the original plan. She had added them because she found, somewhat to her surprise, that the conversation was part of the value. People wanted to know what an Ossabaw hog was. They wanted to know why the fat was different, why the flavor was different, why the bacon she brought to market had a color and texture and smell unlike anything they had bought at a grocery store. She would explain, standing behind her table with its handwritten signs and its single-framed photo of the hogs in the persimmon grove, and she could see something happen in people as they understood it, a kind of rekindling, the way a fire looks when you give it a piece of dry wood after it's been burning on damp. She was not a gregarious woman. She had never been the kind of person who found strangers easy. But she found this conversation easy because it was true, every word of it, and because the product in front of her was the proof of everything she said. She quit the farm supply store in October 2018. The year 2019 was the year things became undeniable, and the year they also nearly broke her. In May of 2019, 2 weeks after she had expanded into a fifth paddock by clearing and fencing 4 more acres of the upper scrub, doing the work herself and with Harris Botter, who had stopped asking if she knew what she was doing and started just showing up on Saturday mornings with his post driver, one of her sows came down sick. The sow was one of her best, a 3-year-old from the Sapello line that Maren had named, privately, November, because she had arrived on a cold November morning with a manner that seemed to know things. November had farrowed twice and raised 23 piglets to weaning, and she went off feed on a Thursday, and by Saturday morning she was showing respiratory symptoms that made Maren's stomach go cold. The vet from Canton came out on Saturday afternoon. He was a large animal vet named Dr. Cecil Pruitt, who had worked Bartow and Cherokee counties for 25 years and who had, in 2 years of working with Maren's hogs, moved from polite skepticism to something that looked a lot like respect. He examined November and he asked questions and he took samples and he drove back to Canton and called Maren that evening and said it looked like a respiratory bacterial infection, likely Pastorella, probably picked up through the fence line from Harris Bonner's cattle somewhere across the ridge. He called in a prescription and told her what to watch for and told her the prognosis was reasonable if they moved fast. They moved fast. 2 weeks of twice-daily treatment, Maren setting her alarm for 3:30 in the morning so she could make the first administration before the day started, working around the schedule of a farm that did not stop because one animal was sick. November pulled through. She came back off antibiotics in early June, and by July she was rooting the creek bottom with the same focused attention she had always brought to it. But the vet bills and the medication costs had put a clean hole in the operating margin Maren had been carefully building. And in August, Priya Rasmussen called with news that Sycamore and Stone was closing. The restaurant industry in Atlanta in 2019 was a difficult place for a small fine dining concept without investor backing, and Priya was honest about it. She called Maren before she made any public announcement and she said she was sorry and that Maren's product had been, genuinely, one of the things she was proudest of having served. Maren thanked her and hung up and stood in the kitchen for a while. The gap left by Sycamore and Stone was real. That account had represented close to 40% of her wholesale volume. She had 2 other Atlanta accounts and the farmers' markets, but the math was uncomfortable. She spent 3 evenings that week making calls and writing emails. She called Grady Llewellyn in Chattanooga, who had by now become a steady account and a genuine admirer of the product, and he asked if she could increase her volume to him. She said she could, partially. She called a new restaurant in Roswell, Georgia called Watershed Table, which had opened on the back of a James Beard nomination for its chef and had the kind of provenance-focused sourcing list that made Maren's product an obvious fit. The chef there was named Marcus Reddick, and he drove out to the farm the following Saturday and walked the land and looked at the records with the same intense focus that Priya Rasmussen had brought, and he said he wanted in. She also made a call she had been thinking about for a while. She called the Bartow County Extension Office and asked to speak with whoever had replaced Dale Fetters, who had retired the previous year. The new agent was a woman named Susan Colquitt, about 10 years younger than Maren, who had a graduate degree in sustainable agriculture from Auburn and who, when Maren explained what she was doing and what she needed, said, "I was wondering when someone in this county was going to do this," in a tone that suggested she had been genuinely waiting. Susan Colquitt came out the following week and walked every paddock and took notes and asked questions that were, in Maren's experience, the questions of someone who intended to be useful. She connected Maren with a USDA value-added producer grant program that Maren had not known about and helped her put together the application. She flagged a Georgia Department of Agriculture heritage breed documentation program that would allow Maren to market under a certified label. The grant application took 6 weeks. The certification process took 4 months. But they both came through. It was the spring of 2020 when the thing that had been building quietly beneath everything finally surfaced, and it surfaced because of a letter. Maren had driven down to Tatnall County to see Caudill Wyatt, who had stopped selling breeding stock 2 years earlier when his health had started its long, slow decline, and who she visited twice a year now, partly for the conversation and partly because she felt the obligation of continuity, the responsibility of someone who has received something irreplaceable to witness the person who gave it. She sat in his kitchen while his wife, a small quiet woman named Georgia Wyatt, set coffee in front of both of them without being asked, and she told him about the farm and the herd numbers and the new accounts. Caudill Wyatt listened with the attention of someone who doesn't have time to waste on anything less than the whole truth. He was 74 and he had emphysema, and he sat with an oxygen concentrator humming beside his chair, and he listened to everything Maren said. And when she finished, he got up slowly and went to the back of the house and came back with a manila folder. He set it on the table between them. He said it was something he had been holding on to for a while and didn't know what to do with, and that he thought she probably ought to have it. Inside the folder were 37 pages of handwritten notes and observations, accumulated over 22 years, from Eloise Parham, the Savannah woman whose knowledge of Ossabaw hog behavior and management Maren had accessed by phone years earlier. Eloise Parham had died in the winter of 2019, quietly and at home, and before she died she had mailed this folder to Caudill Wyatt with a note that said, simply, "For whoever is serious about continuing this." Maren turned the pages slowly. It was everything. 42 years of breeding records, forage observation notes, health records, notes on individual animal personalities and tendencies, seasonal weight management protocols, and a long undated section written in a finer hand at the end titled, "What the Hogs Know That We Have Forgotten How to See." She had to stop reading partway through the 3rd page because her vision went blurry. Georgia Wyatt set a hand on her shoulder and didn't say anything, and then quietly went to refill the coffee. Eloise Parham had written, in 1987, a description of a technique she called reading the root, watching precisely where and how deeply a hog rooted in different seasons as a behavioral indicator of nutritional status. She had documented it over 8 years with 31 animals, and it was, as far as Maren could tell, the most detailed behavioral health monitoring guide for the Ossabaw breed that had ever existed, and it had been sitting in a manila folder in a farmhouse in Tatnall County, and now Maren was holding it in her hands. She understood, sitting at that kitchen table with Caudill Wyatt's oxygen concentrator humming and Georgia Wyatt's coffee going warm between her palms, that everything she had been doing for 3 years had a longer lineage than she had known. That the path under her feet had been walked by women before her, quietly, without recognition, and that the folder in her hands was a form of inheritance she had done nothing to earn except to take the work seriously enough that it could find its way to her. She drove home with the folder on the passenger seat, and she did not listen to the radio. The year 2021 was, by every practical measure, the year the farm became real. The Heritage Pork Initiative certification came through in March, carrying the designation Bartow County, registered Ossabaw Island breed, certified mast and forage, which meant that every pound of pork Maren sold could now carry a label that documented exactly what the animal was and how it had been raised. Grady Llewellyn in Chattanooga put that label on his menu and wrote a paragraph about the farm in his sourcing notes, and the Atlanta magazine food column ran a piece about Watershed Table in which Marcus Reddick was quoted saying that Maren Caudill's Ossabaw pork was the most honest thing on the plate. The piece ran in June. The phone started ringing in July. She added 4 new accounts by September. 2 in Atlanta, 1 in Athens, 1 in Birmingham, Alabama. She expanded the herd to 31 sows and 5 boars across 7 paddocks, the rotation now so precisely calibrated to the land's forage cycle that she had, by her own careful accounting, reduced her supplemental feed costs by 31% compared to the first year while maintaining weight gain rates that met or exceeded her original projections. She hired help for the first time, a young woman from the agricultural program at Reinhardt University, 22 years old, named Bex Hollis, who came out 3 mornings a week and who had, within 2 months, developed the kind of quiet attentiveness to the animals that Maren recognized as the real thing. She gave Bex a copy of 3 pages from Eloise Parham's notes, the section on reading the route, and Bex read it carefully and then went out to the paddock and practiced it for an hour and came back and asked 3 questions that told Maren she had understood it. Harris Bonner had a mild heart attack in October of 2021. He was home within 4 days and his wife called Maren and Maren brought them a smoked shoulder from the last processing run and sat with them for an afternoon. Harris looked thinner but he looked clear-eyed. He said, sitting on his own porch with a blanket over his knees in the October afternoon, that he owed her an apology. She asked what for. He said for not believing sooner. She told him she didn't need an apology. He said he was going to give her one anyway because he was a stubborn old man and he intended to die with his debts settled. He said he had watched what she'd built on that land for 4 years and he wanted her to know that he had been wrong and she had been right and that those were not words he used carelessly. She accepted the apology. She thought he deserved to give it. The winter of 2021 into 2022 was when she first understood the scale of what was happening. The accounts had grown steadily enough that she was now turning away inquiries, a thing she had not imagined doing, a problem she had not let herself imagine having. She had been careful about growth, deliberately slow, because the land had a carrying capacity and she would not exceed it. The carrying capacity of 63 acres of Pacolet sandy loam planted in mast-producing scrub and managed with careful rotational grazing was, by her own accounting, a maximum of 40 sows and proportional boars, with 110 to 120 market hogs per year at the weights and finish levels her buyers required. She had mapped this out in the notebook in December of 2021. The first time she had run the numbers at full capacity, all 40 sows, all accounts, the certified label at the price point the certification supported, the total came out to a figure she wrote down and then crossed out and recalculated, slowly, twice more, because she did not trust the first answer. $47,230. Annual gross revenue at full operation. She had crossed that number out twice and written it again twice and it came out the same every time. The same year, 2022, she received a letter from the University of Georgia College of Agricultural and Environmental Sciences, from a researcher in the Animal and Dairy Science Department who had been following the Heritage Pork Initiative program and who wanted to visit the farm as a potential case study in sustainable small-scale heritage breed management. The researcher's name was Dr. Thomas Arroyave and he came out in April and spent a full day at the farm with a graduate student and a notepad, and he walked every paddock and examined the rotation records and the forage documentation and the breeding logs and he sat with Maren at the kitchen table and looked at the composition notebook, the original one, the cheap black dollar store book with Ossabaw on the cover, for a long time. He asked if she would be willing to be interviewed for a paper. She said she would need to think about it. He left her his card. She set the card next to the notebook on the kitchen table, and she thought about it for 2 weeks, and then she called him and said yes. On the condition that Eloise Parham's notes were cited as a primary source. On the condition that Cordell Wyatt's name was in the acknowledgments. On the condition that the paper not be written as if what she had done was unusual, because she knew that it wasn't, that women had been managing difficult land and difficult breeds with this kind of focused knowledge for generations, without recognition, and that the research should reflect that. Dr. Arroyave said he could agree to all 3 conditions. The paper was published in the Journal of Sustainable Agriculture in December of 2022 under the title Rotational Management of Ossabaw Island Hogs on Marginal Upland Soil, a case study in heritage breed viability. Maren's farm was the sole case study. The acknowledgments thanked Eloise Parham and Cordell Wyatt by name. The Heritage Pork Initiative sent their letter 7 days after publication. And so on the 12th morning, a Thursday in mid-January 2023, Maren Caudill picked up the envelope that had been sitting on her kitchen table for 11 days. She did not open it immediately. She put on her barn coat and her boots and she went out to do the morning rounds first, because the hogs needed to be checked before the temperature dropped further and there was ice on the water troughs that needed breaking and Bex wasn't coming until Friday. She walked the first paddock in the gray morning cold, her breath making shapes in the still air, and she watched the Ossabaw sows move in their unhurried way through the frost-stiff grass, noses working, reading the ground. She watched November, 7 years old now and moving a little slower through the cold mornings but still with that focused attention, still with that manner that seemed to know things. She watched a pair of the younger gilts from the most recent Sapello line litter working a corner of the paddock where the persimmon suckers came up thick, rooting at the right depth for the season, exactly as Eloise Parham had described. She stood at the paddock fence for a while. The county road was quiet below the property. The ridge above the farm showed the bare gray-brown of January hardwood, and the scrub oaks held their last leaves, tan and papery, and the morning was that particular winter color that is not quite silver and not quite blue but something between them. A red-tailed hawk moved along the ridge without any apparent effort, riding whatever the cold air held up. She went back inside. She stood at the kitchen table and she picked up the envelope and she opened it. The letter inside was 2 pages. The first page was formal language, certification language, the terminology of official recognition. She read through it carefully, as she read everything carefully, and she reached the number on the bottom of the first page and she read it and she set the letter down and stood with her hands flat on the kitchen table. $47,230, gross annual revenue, fiscal year 2022. Certification of the highest single-year gross revenue recorded in the Bartow County Heritage Pork Initiative program since its founding. Designation as a case study operation for the state program's expansion materials. A formal notation that the operation had been achieved on what the county's own soil survey classified as highly marginal agricultural land. She read the second page. It was a personal note from Susan Colquitt, the extension agent, written in ink on a separate sheet of extension office letterhead. It said, in part, "I know you've been doing this work without anyone from this office making it easier. I want the record to reflect that I know that." Maren set the letter down again. She stood in her kitchen in the January morning and she looked out the east window at the ironstone pitcher on the sill, the one that had been there since before she could remember, the one her mother had kept winter branches in when there were no flowers to cut. The morning light was coming through it now. The pitcher was a pale amber color, the kind of old clay that goes translucent when the light hits it just right, and the light it made on the pine floor was a warm spreading thing, unhurried, taking its time. She thought about her father, who had loved this land and never quite known what to do with it. She thought about the almanacs on the shelf with his pencil marks in the margins, the shorthand notations of a man who paid attention to weather and season and the small patterns that governed a farming year, a man who had given her the habit of noticing without ever putting it in those words.